My name is Jeffrey Bustos. Excited to be here today. We're going to kind of do a 101 on what retail media is. It's an introductory course into retail media that we've done in the US. I've been working in IAB US for about 3 years, developing best practices and standards for retail media in the US, working closely with IAB Europe and also the various different countries in Latin America to develop it. The objective of today's conversation is to ensure that everyone here has an overview of not just what retail media is, but how to think about it from a creative strategy, media planning, and measurement perspective. So we'll go through each of these different topics. So obviously retail media has exploded mainly due to COVID and changes in commerce. During COVID, a lot of the trade budgets that brands were investing within trade, within an in-store environment, they weren't able to invest it, so they moved all of these budgets into e-commerce, and this is what accelerated the growth of retail media in 2020. And due to the success of these investments from brands and retailers, retail media has continued to accelerate the last 4 years. We're in the third wave of digital advertising. Everyone always says this, but what they don't say, and I think it's a huge point of importance, is when you grow really fast, there's a lot of growing pains. Kind of think about when you were young and you went through puberty and you grew really fast and it was like kind of your awkward age. That's kind of where we are in retail media. These are like kind of the awkward years of retail media. And a lot of what we try to do with the IAB is ensure that we can have more guidelines, best practices, and standards within retail media so we can move retail media into maturity. So what is retail media? We defined retail media as the ability to leverage first-party data for targeting, messaging, and measurement. When I say first-party data, it also means when a consumer walks into a store, that is first-party data. So you as a consumer inside Migros, you are first-party data because you're able to be shown messaging, you're able to be targeted in a general way, and you're able to be measured within an in-store environment as well as an online environment. This definition is really important because globally we've seen the rise of commerce media, and commerce media does not allow all three of those to exist in the same place. For example, United Airlines, you can now see ads in United Airlines. United Airlines launched a retail media network. PayPal has launched one, Chase, Marriott, and I expect more of these commerce media networks to rise, but that's the difference between retail media and commerce media. So within those, retail media has three different sort of assets and properties. The first one is on-site. One of the interesting things as we look at retail media globally is how it's grown differently in different regions. For example, within Europe, and I'll count Turkey when I talk about overall, Europe is that we've seen a stronger presence in display ads on site, and we've seen much stronger presence in store. Whereas in the US and Canada, we've seen much bigger investment on site search and display. In-store is still really nascent and new in the United States and Canada. And then we're seeing a similar pattern to Europe in Latin America, with in-store being really big, and then on-site display, and then brands are just starting to roll out sponsored products. And then off-site, still not a thing in Latin America or most parts of Europe. On-site is really important because that's when the consumer has the propensity to buy. Me as a consumer, I go to Mimeda'nın, I'm ready to purchase. However, it's really important to be aware of the fact that the moment a consumer goes to your website, they've already made a decision on what they're going to buy. They've made a decision on 2 or 3 brands they're going to buy. So if you're not one of those 2 or 3 brands, you've lost. Also, the moment the consumer searches something for something on site, they're going to compare 2 or 3 brands. So it's incredibly important when you think about on-site is to ensure that you're complementing your on-site strategy with off-site. Discoverability is incredibly important in a digital world. So if you want to ensure that you're one of the 2 or 3 brands the consumer has in mind when they're on the website, you want to ensure that you have a strong off-site presence and you're investing in off-site. Especially because in Turkey, 82% of sales happen in a store environment. So when I walk into a store, I already know 80% of the things I'm going to buy. 20% of my purchases in store are impulse buys. a lot of times we forget we're consumers. When we go to the grocery store, we already know the milk we're going to buy, we know the cereal we're going to buy, we know the meat we're going to buy, we know most of the things we're going to buy and the brands we're going to buy. Obviously, we may discover new brands and we try new brands, but 80% of the brands we're going to buy, we already know before we enter the store. And this is where the value of offsite is. If you want to have those 80% of the consumer basket, you need to be communicating with the consumer offsite. In-store is an incredibly important place for you to connect with the consumer. One of the things that I've been saying a lot this week is when you think about the consumer, yourselves as the consumer doesn't just have a monetary budget. The consumer doesn't just have, I have $200 to spend on groceries. That's really important. But as consumers also have a time budget. I have 5 minutes to go grocery shopping today after work. Or I have an hour to spend grocery shopping on a Saturday or Sunday. So you're thinking about the monetary budget, you're thinking about the time budget, and then the third budget you have the consumer is a frustration budget. I want to be able to solve my problem as quickly and efficiently as possible. So when the consumer is within a store and you're working with the trade team in the store planogram and you're trying to identify key areas to engage with consumers, it is imperative that you look on how you can solve the frustration problem for the consumer. You can have the best promotion, you can have the best packaging, design, product, but if the consumer does not understand, you're not solving the consumer and you're not understanding the consumer path within a store, you will not be discovered by the consumer. And that's really where we start the value of data monetization. If we think about our relationship with a grocery store especially, it's a very intimate relationship. Migros or any grocery store knows when you have kids, when you start a new job, when you start to do sport, any life changes are being tracked and grocers understand each of these different life changes. So it's imperative for you to really work with the retailer to understand this consumer life changes, because that's where we can really make a connection with the consumer. The difference between retail data and any other sort of digital data, because if you think about everything we've talked about, in-store advertising isn't new. Trade has been around for decades. Sponsored products and display ads aren't new. They've been around for over 10 years. Off-site, social platforms, CTV are relatively new, but they're not new. But what retail media is new is in the ability to bring all these ecosystems together within one place and being able to leverage the data to understand consumer behavior and adapt to consumer behavior. That's a change in retail media. It's advertising that is adapting to consumer behavior. It's not making consumers adapt to the advertising messaging. So when we think about retail media, we've seen the rise of various different media networks. We've seen the rise of marketplaces, mass merchandisers, category specialists, commerce intermediaries, and obviously new commerce media networks, as I mentioned before. So what we're going to spend some time today is talking about how we're going to be planning retail media. But before we do that, let's talk about closed loop measurement, which is probably one of the biggest values of retail media. Closed loop measurement means the consumer sees the ad, and then me as an advertiser know what the outcome of the ad was. I can see if somebody saw an ad, was there an increase in brand searches? Was there an increase in product description site traffic? Was there an increase in sales? Was there a change in percent category share, new to brand? These are the outcomes that are imperative and really important, especially with GDPR and a lot of privacy changes and Apple's IDFA. A lot of the data signals you had 5-10 years ago do not exist. 50% of the internet is unidentifiable, it's unaddressable. You're not able to get the same level of granularity in measurement that you were able to do 5-10 years ago. Within retail media, you can, because you are actually able to know the specific impact of an ad to an outcome. And that's another huge value that retail media enables us to have. So obviously there are challenges. Fortunately, we are working as the IAB to address these challenges. IAB Europe, which Mimeda is part of IAB Europe, and IAB Turkey works closely with IAB Europe, has launched retail media measurement standards. They recently launched certification to those standards. The US and Europe We just developed in-store standards as well. So we're working closely to define these standards, and the great thing is that even from a US perspective, Mimeda has been hugely proactive and supportive in a lot of the work the IAB has done within Turkey, Europe, and I would say even globally as well. So obviously, what we're going to do next is talk about the planning process. One of the biggest problems in advertising is one of the biggest benefits in the growth. Advertising is very verticalized. You have your social team, you have your display team, you have your video team. However, retail media kind of compresses all of that together, and it necessitates the requirement for you to actually collaborate internally. What we're seeing is that brands are not talking internally. The social team does not know what the search team is doing, does not know what the display team is doing, does not know what the video team is doing. Before, this wasn't so much of an issue, but now that you're using the same data, you're looking at the ecosystem of the consumer, it is incredibly confusing for the consumer, because the consumer is walking through Migros, on their phones, on TikTok, on Meta, on the internet. We're hybrid, we're living both worlds at the same time. So if you do not know what your social team is doing, if you do not know what your email marketing team is doing, you don't have an omni-channel strategy, you have chaos and confusion for your consumer. So the most important thing is when you start thinking about the briefing process is to ensure that you are connecting each part of the brief. First of all, you want to make sure that you understand the brand brief. The whole team needs to understand what the brand brief is, even when you're not part of the brand team. It is imperative so that you have consistent communication throughout the consumer journey. Obviously, messaging within a social platform such as TikTok might be different from Instagram, might be different from email, but the messaging overall and the theme of the messaging has to be consistent for the consumer. Then you want to make sure that the whole team understands the campaign brief. The brand team needs to know how the media team is thinking on specific campaigns to ensure it aligns with the brand strategy. And then this finally has to align with the retailer brief. Each of these touch points is imperative, especially as retail media moves just from being an on-site and in-store strategy to being an omni-channel strategy with off-site. This also includes working closely with your trade teams. As brands, it is imperative you know what your trade teams are negotiating with the retailer. Because for example, maybe you're a brand that does really good online, so you want to be able to negotiate better terms, better placements, better new products from an online perspective, and negotiate what you can get within an in-store environment, and vice versa. If you're a brand that is a store-first brand, you want to make sure that say, how can I leverage my retail media online investment to get better placements within the store? I'm not saying you do a joint JBP process, but what I am saying is ensuring that you have this communication internally with each of these teams. So as I mentioned, you want to make sure that you're aligning retailer and brand goals with target audiences. You want to make sure you understand your executive level objectives, and you want to understand brand and enterprise level objectives. And this is incredibly important in measurement as well. ROAS is incredibly important. How much product you're moving, your conversions, revenue is incredibly important. But you also need to understand that once I know my revenue, it's too late to do anything about my revenue. So you need to have 3 levels of metrics. You have your overall performance as a category brand. That's your main KPI. Then you have your leading indicators. These are new to brand, purchase frequency, incrementality. These are the metrics that are telling you what is impacting my revenue. Did my revenue or ROAS increase because consumers purchased more frequently? Did they purchase more? Was it my price increase? And then you have your lagging indicators, and these are the indicators that are going to help you optimize your media. You can't really optimize a new to brand, but you need to understand what are the metrics such as product description, site traffic, increase in brand search, CPCs, any sort of metrics that help you understand what are the first metrics I need to optimize so that I can understand my leading indicators so I can really deliver on ROAS. So in that, a lot of metrics have been defined, such as incrementality, new to brand, and category share. Again, the objective of these metrics is to really understand what happened with your campaign. If you are doing reports for your boss and you're just showing the report, then you're not really leveraging the value of retail media. Retail media data is expensive. but it's expensive because it provides a lot of value. But if you as advertisers are not using that, you're not taking advantage of the value of retail media data, then you're kind of just being a little wasteful with it. And what I mean to say with that is that you want to ensure that you don't just tell your boss, ROAS increased 10%. You want to say, ROAS increased 10% because we saw that we had a 20% increase in purchase frequency, or ROAS remained flat, but mainly because we decreased prices of the product, but we were able to increase conversion rates of that product, and we were able to advance new brands to the category. Or we were able to increase new category share from consumers that have never bought from that category. And a lot of these data points will help you plan better for the future. Measurement should be solely for you to plan better for the future. Measurement is not a reporting tool. And if you look at retail media, especially retail media measurement, as a way to plan for the future, then you're really able to fully enable the value and power of the first party data. So in a lot of when you start thinking about retail media, it's important to understand obviously store locations, geography, stock levels, and potential out of stock options. And then you also want to understand the different levels of segmentation. Obviously, from an online perspective, you can have a lot more one-to-one segmentation. From an in-store perspective, we don't really talk about personalization, we talk about localization. How can you ensure that you're adapting creative and messaging in the planogram to a more general audience? As I mentioned, and I will talk about this and then we'll wrap up, is that it's incredibly important for you to have collaboration internally. That is probably the most important thing, and this is where brands struggle the most in retail media. Organizational mapping is imperative. So what we're seeing a lot is that you have to have a unified briefing process. You can have separate JBP negotiations, that's fine, but you need to understand what each of your teams are negotiating. You need to understand your total retail media strategy. Otherwise, you as brands are leaving dollars and value in the table, and you want to ensure that this collaborative planning. If you work for an agency, working at an agency, your job is much more difficult because you need to be able to manage and steer this cohesive, unified retail media strategy to ensure that brands are communicating internally. And what we're seeing a lot is we're seeing different models in how brands and retailers are changing organizationally. People keep saying, where do retail media monies come from? And if retail media dollars are being funded from different sources, such as trade, brand, digital, then we have to ask, what is the impact of an organization when different teams are investing in retail media? And with different teams investing in different retail media, what we've seen is a lot of times the same brand is three different departments within the brand are investing in retail media, but they're not communicating with themselves on how they're investing in retail media. So now you have an ecosystem system where there's an email campaign with the retailer, there's a social campaign with the retailer, and then there's an in-store campaign with the retailer, but there's no internal communication within that brand on how that is. So what we're recommending is ensuring that there's internal communication and collaboration. There's different ways of doing this, there's not a correct way, but one is having an integrated center of excellence where you have a centralized team that has an overview of all the different campaigns that are happening. This is a great way to have consistent strategies and planning and budgeting. Obviously, there's a lot of tensions. If before you owned a certain level of budget and now another team has control of that, that can create a lot of tensions. There's also the view of having a specific lead on every department and having bi-weekly meetings across the different departments so you can communicate. This ensures that each of the departments still have control and power over their budgets. The con is people's times. It's difficult to plan, agendas, but the most important thing, and I would say don't go and hire a consulting company to do this, but really start just seeing how can we communicate better internally as a team, and then slowly a structure will emerge that works for your company, because obviously if you're managing a lot of large brands, a lot of smaller brands, it will be different across the different categories. So really what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you're aligning the common goals, structuring partnerships, and sharing insights. And this can be whether you do a separate JBP negotiations or you do joint JBP negotiations. Either way, however your team wants to do it, the really important to do is to ensure that you're negotiating these agreements so that they're most beneficial to you, and you're choosing the right engagement model, whether it's self-organized, a media-led, or a holistic JBP. I don't think there's any specific right way of doing it as long as you're collaborating and communicating internally. I will pause for questions. Yes?
So, I'll start from the end. Actually, this is kind of a really tough situation because you said, as you said, there are different marketing, let's say, departments or even silos that face different goals. And while, I mean, this is a new media, so a new type of media. In the last one of the slides, you showed different approaches to, like, maybe streamlining how this planning is going to occur. But really, it's all about also about the budget. So, do you believe that there will be some budget, let's say, carving out some budgets from different parts and pouring it into retail media, or should it have its own budgeting in an annual planning? What's your view on that?
So as more money moves into retail media, we're going to see two things. We're starting to see it. One, larger brands are asking now for quarterly planning instead of yearly planning, especially because digital e-commerce moves in a quarterly planning basis, not so much an yearly planning basis. And then the second thing is, as more budget gets carved into retail media, the idea of specialist roles won't really exist. One of the problems the US agencies are having right now is if you're running a Meta ad using a product feed from Migros and using Migros data, is your social team running that campaign? Is it your retail media team running that campaign? And again, advertising agencies and brands verticalize themselves because all these technologies were very technical, very new, and you need to have people that were specialists. I think the next phase of advertising, especially with AI, we're going to move to more generalists where people within an agency can manage different campaigns and have an understanding. And then obviously AI can take a lot of the automation. So I think that's where we're going to be moving in that direction. Yes?
Well, retail media is not only one media, but a combination of different mediums, right? Mm-hmm. As you talked. And you talked about closed loop measurement and optimization. But what I wonder is there any study or work all around the world which would eventually give one, combined reach for all types of retail media, like a cross-media measurement work?
So when we think about retail media measurement, it's really difficult. So one of the things that we had to balance is that, for example, if you're a store that sells televisions versus if you're selling groceries, and then if you are a mass merchandiser that sells televisions and groceries, you shouldn't have the same measurement model because you have different consumer purchase frequency, you have different data sources, especially do you have loyalty data, do you not have loyalty data? So a lot of what we looked is how can we have standards but also flexibility. A lot of the work that we're looking right now is to ensure that brands can compare performance from one retailer to another. In Turkey right now, there's not a lot of retail media networks, but if you look at what's happening globally, Coca-Cola operates across more than 30 retail media networks in the US. Chobani, which is a smaller brand, they have 17 retail media networks that they work with. So imagine having to compare performance across 17 different retail media networks. So we're seeing a lot of the work that we've done in the IB is to ensure you can compare it. Long term, we're gonna see is the ability for you to say, what is the halo effect of me buying Migros data across other retailers? Because obviously we as consumers don't just shop at Migros. The average, each of us go to 2 to 3 different grocery stores on a monthly basis. So if you see an ad in Migros, that could actually impact your purchase at another grocery store. So we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. I know that, Circana, Merkle, a lot of different agencies and data companies are looking how you can have the cross-retailer attribution and then also comparative retailer attribution.
So basically what you say is, yes, people are considering, given a combined reach or at least comparison between different retailers, right?
Yep.
But what I ask is basically one retailer combining all their media, like, you know, in-store radio, for instance, and they can also Walmart, for instance. They can have on-site posters, like outdoor posters, and then their digital site. Can they give a combined reach of those different media within one
Got it.
network?
Yes and no. It is an ideal goal, but one, consumer data privacy is really important. There's also the issue of implied consent. So if you walk into a grocery store, you've given the retailer some level of consent, but not the same level of consent, implied consent, you give to a retailer in a digital capability. So there is the ability for you to measure in-store impact with online, but that requires, if I have a loyalty card if I'm a loyalty member from Migros and I go shop, then you can create the full ecosystem, and Migros is doing that. But if I just go to Migros and I shop and I'm not a loyalty member, then I'm not given consent as a person for Migros to do that ecosystem. So even though Migros has really strong first-party data, there's still a small percentage that has to be probabilistic data. And a lot of retailers like Walmart has a lot more probabilistic data compared to Kroger that has a lot more deterministic data. So it is a balance, but we are starting to see, to your point, retailers have this full ad network where you can use, you know, that retailer data to buy Disney, YouTube, New York Times, CNN. You can buy in-store advertising, and then the retailer can tell you the overall impact of that advertising. And we're going to start seeing the rise of ad networks, where you can start looking at that data across different categories and places.